Welcome to Education Perspectives. I am your host, Liza Holland. This is a podcast that explores the role of education in our society from a variety of lenses. Education needs to evolve to meet the needs of today and the future. Solving such huge issues requires understanding. Join me as we begin to explore the many perspectives of education. Welcome back to Education Perspectives. We are delighted to have Sheela Vanhoose, who is a shareholder and education lobbyist from the Southern Group. She is also the founder of TSG Advisors. Well, Sheela Vanhoose, thank you so very much for joining us here on Education Perspectives. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm really excited to have a conversation today about education policy.
Oh, me too. So got to kick you off with a 30,000-foot question. Why do you think that we as a society should invest in education?
It's such a great question. I've heard you ask this on your podcast prior. And for me, education is about unlocking potential. And, a lot of folks will look at education from an economic lens, from a, world view, but ultimately in our education system, and not just education system, because we're lifelong learners, right? We're constantly learning. I learned listening to your podcast, reading books from people in my life, in addition to formal education. But learning allows us to unlock dreams of students. It allows upward mobility. So I always say, for me, education is about unlocking potential, and that is why I'm in this space.
I love that answer because you are right. And I particularly the piece about lifelong learning. If we're not learning, we're dying, right?
Right. No, it's true. So true. You can learn good things and bad things, right? Like you're just constantly learning.
So I understand that you founded the education portion of your practice there with the Southern Group. What drew you to education as a practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like a lot of lobbyists, you kind of fall into an area. And so I have a very traditional, like from campaign trail to lobbying. Along the way, got picked up to help and lead policy at Broward County Public Schools, which is sixth largest school district in the country, down in Broward County in Florida. And then I found myself just moving from education organization to education and just completely falling in love in the policy area. And I'm really grateful for a lot of education mentors who poured into me and taught me along the way. And so I just have never left. And so I've worked for large public, private, and nonprofit education organizations. And then 6 years ago, joined the Southern Group really to focus on their education practice. And, the Southern Group is the largest lobbying firm in the state of Florida. They represent your traditional early learning centers and public school systems and universities and colleges, but also lots of private companies that are really interested in education and what is happening in our education system, from workforce issues and industry certifications to, this growing market around education technology and individual companies that are trying to partner with school districts, colleges, and universities. So it's just such an interesting lens to see education from our itty bitty learners to lifelong learners, like we talked about earlier, and everything in between in terms of how, districts are making budget decisions and then what's happening in the classroom. And there's so many, when we try to solve problems, there's so much happening, and it makes education such a rewarding policy area to be a part of.
Well, I love your bio talks about sitting at the intersection of education policy, funding, innovation, and implementation. And what a great, kind of large view as far as looking at the system as a whole, because the policy does not always connect with the implementation, right?
So true. It's so true. When you think of like the 5 stages of public policy making, right? From ideation into implementation, there's a lot of pieces. It's not just the, words on a bill that get passed. That legislative intent is important. How a state agency might interpret that piece of legislation and the regulation they put around it. But then what that is, like if you think of a K-12 realm, that is now sent down to a school district, which usually puts some local school district policy around it and then makes its way into the classroom, to the schoolhouse, to the classroom, and so much in between A lot of times in the lobbying world, between legislators and lobbyists, we stop at that place of passing a bill. It's signed by the governor and we walk away. And I like to continue that thought through of like what is happening in the regulatory environment. But even so much, like the last stage of public policy making is evaluation. So are we assessing, and I don't know if we do that very well across the country, that we pass bills, but then are we assessing the effectiveness? And if it's not working, are we willing to walk away from those bills, right? Or are we willing to go back and fix? And I know we spend a lot of time what we call glitch bills in Florida. And I know in Kentucky, you probably do the same thing, going back and fixing education bills or adding to them. So that, that's always a really fun lens to look at education through the entire life cycle of policy.
Boy, it sure is. And there are glitches, as you can imagine. And so much is happening right now. We had talked briefly about this intersection between the work world and what they want and need versus what education is actually providing them right now. And that's kind of where my heart sits at this minute. How is that playing out in Florida as far as, do you see any major changes on the horizon as far as how we do school? As you mentioned, the assessment piece, that's always a big question as far as legislators are concerned. But tell me a little bit about your policy environment there and what's going on and what's on top of mind there.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing, Florida has really led on school choice in the state. So for years now, we have had a tax credit program dating back to 2001. We have had like an open enrollment, so you're not bounded by a district. And so as long as there's capacity, you think of these large metro areas, Miami, Broward, Fort Lauderdale, you might live in one county in one school district, but your family might work, your mom might work near another school district. And so boundaries being gone was, as long as there's capacity, was allowable years ago. We have really robust magnet programs and accelerated learning programs for students to choose from in our traditional public school system. Charter schools have expanded across the state. And now we have one of the largest complete universal voucher programs in the country. I think we're entering year 2 or year 3 of that program. And so it's not income based. And families can choose to either, pull down on their state dollars, the contribution that we put aside per student for private school tuition. They can also utilize those funds for homeschool and to offset some of those costs. So it's been just a really interesting journey. And I know as Florida has this model, and a lot of states are working towards this or have this already in play. Now, come next year, we're going to have the same model at a much larger scale at the federal level, which will be a complement for states that already have a mass education savings account program or voucher program. That federal program will be a nice complement to it. It'll be interesting in states, I think like Kentucky, you just passed the federal piece, right, with HB1. So I don't think you have an existing state program, right? So you'll have just the federal layer, which will be really interesting to see.
Yeah, Kentucky was very interesting. We had it as a part of our Constitution. State dollars are not allowed to be used for private school types of things and whatnot. And so that came up as a ballot measure and was defeated in Kentucky, interestingly enough. So we've been doing a lot in our major school districts around developing lots of magnet types of programs and specialty sorts of things and trying to kind of do it on an in-house basis, if you will. But it's still a huge part of the conversation here. So I'm curious, can you tell me a little bit about how that's actually playing out in Florida? If Kentucky were ever to decide to do a local and or a state and federal program combined, kind of what is that looking like, and what kind of impact is that having on the public schools?
Yeah, it's definitely creating a consumer market, right? Where parents and families can choose the educational options that are best for them. We saw this a lot with our just general school choice previously, and we continue to see it today. So if your bounded school is not meeting your needs as a family, your ability to take your dollars and find the right educational opportunity for your family, it is incredible. And so it's actually going really well in the state of Florida. I will say what we are seeing is a slight decline in your traditional public school enrollment as families are able to walk away. But we also, that's also, we have lower birth rates. And in Florida, we have a lot of movement happening of, we tend to be a more retiree location. And so that coupled with just larger birth trends across the world, but that coupled with choice, we are seeing a slight decline in enrollment in our traditional public school system. So I think when you ask how's it going, there's so many different lenses we have to look at it. From a administrator school district perspective, you have to now balance that your costs are probably stable, right? If you go from 18 children to a classroom to 16 children in a classroom, you're still going to have the same cost. You're still going to need that educator, but you have less revenue coming in. And so that's one. From the parent and family side, you feel for families that have said, their child is being bullied in the classroom and no one's listening. No one's helping pull their child out of that situation. I had one of my cousins call me when I was working for the school district. Her child has a peanut allergy, a deathly peanut allergy. And the teacher in the classroom would constantly bring jars of peanut butter into the classroom and sit there and eat. And no matter, she brought her issue to the teacher, she brought it to the school nurse, she brought it to the AP, she brought it to the principal, and no one did anything about it until she finally said, I have to remove my child from this school, right? So you hear about these other situations where no one's listening to the families, or no one's listening to mom or dad complain, or maybe their child's not being challenged academically. And so we haven't always needed to respond in our traditional public school system, right? There's a lot happening in the private market. You're constantly responding to the needs of the customer in many ways. And so that has been really interesting to see districts respond in a different way because they need to ensure that they're being responsive to families, right? And they're addressing the needs, or they're keeping kids safe. So it is interesting to watch. It'll be even more interesting to see with the federal component. I will tell you, I'm already seeing some school districts start to think about what we do in higher ed. What is pay per credit, right? So if you're a private school family, maybe you don't want to do an AP calculus class at home. Maybe you want to come to the local school district for that single class. So what is that revenue driver? Districts in Florida are starting to think about their excess capacity in buildings. And instead of having, that cost driver there, starting to think of, can I lease that to a charter school or to a private school, an excess part of their building, especially if it's a separate building on campus with a separate entrance, and bring in that revenue. So it's interesting in that I'm seeing districts think like a business, and I know their core business is teaching and learning, but at the more centralized level, thinking about the enterprise, thinking about the business, and how that revenue moves around the district. It has been quite interesting to watch, and this is only the beginning, right? We're sitting at the mountain, we're at the foothills, just kind of at the start of the climb.
Oh, that's so interesting. And, a lot of positives coming out of that, as from what you're bringing forward. It is such a challenging ecosystem. What are you seeing in higher ed in Florida as far as, are they starting to rethink their model at all? Because I just think in the long term, especially with AI and the increasing costs of higher education, you wonder if the ROI is really there for going and getting your traditional 4-year degree the way that it once was. And so I'm expecting that in a number of years, we might start to see a change in how higher education is done, as far as, kind of more stacking credits to be able to, to make your own sort of custom degree. I don't know. I'm just curious, because some of that's what's being discussed now. And I'm just curious if that's happening in Florida as well.
Yeah, we're not there in your choose your own adventure. So just yet, right? But industry certifications are huge in the state of Florida. And we actually put a lot of funding, both in the K-12 space and the state college space, towards industry certification. So every time a learner earns an industry certification, There is a bonus that is awarded to the district, to the college, to the educator. And so it really drives that attainment. And we're constantly evaluating industry certifications for the value of the certification, the demand inside industry, what is the job market look like for those industry certifications in order to make sure that we have high quality industry certifications, right? If we're going to make that investment, make it a skill that is going to benefit the learner. And so we have really driven towards industry certification, starting all the way down in middle school and then through college. That's one. I think secondly, we've really transformed. Our colleges aren't called community colleges anymore. They've revamped, and they are state colleges able to offer baccalaureate degrees in addition to your traditional associate's degree. But they are really at the college level when I think of what's happening within communities, because every community is different. Our state college system is able to address local community needs and workforce needs in a very fast and way. And so we have seen them be a little bit more nimble in trying to set up programs. But we know setting up programs is expensive when you think of all the costs, the faculty costs, and then once you get it up and running, you're not going to, dismantle them. So it's really difficult. But like a stackable credential in the higher ed space, we're not seeing that fully. But again, industry certifications have been really big, driving towards workforce, apprenticeship programs. We've really invested in that in the state of Florida.
We're seeing the same here in Kentucky because that bridge between education and business is getting kind of a little murky, especially with the durable skill sets that really need to happen. One of the things that just passed in Kentucky was House Bill 257, which is going to start to hold schools accountable for some local indicators of quality. I don't know if you've heard of like a portrait of a graduate.
Yes. South Carolina was one of the first states to do portrait of a graduate.
So they're basically looking at, okay, we're now actually going to start to hold our schools accountable. It was kind of like the first step in the piece, but I'm kind of excited about it because, you get what you hold schools accountable for, right?
Yes. It's so interesting. You talk about durable skills, but we're still hearing industry talk about soft skills and what's missing. And I once was talking to a tech leader, and their response was like, we can teach the durable skills, right? Like if you think about various coding skills or coding language, like things are changing continuously. And as a company, we can teach that. But I can't teach someone how to respond in an email. I like things that, look me in the eye and have a conversation. And so those soft skills I continuously hear are needed, and how we continue to, I just so often in policy, we have problems in society and we turn around and say, hey, let's pass a bill and let's teach it in the K-12 system, in the post-secondary system. And so those conversations are still taking place. And another one that was really big this year in Florida was around cursive writing, and to go back to teaching cursive, it is so funny because I would try to sit down and write something. And I was like, I don't remember how to do a Z, right? Like I just stopped for a moment, and because like I rarely am even penmanship is probably horrible. My mother would be so upset because I'm typing all the time. So we had that conversation in Florida. But I think what's interesting, as you look at policy across the country, this 2026, about 500 bills, education bills passed across the states. And, you would think in the day and age of AI, we've heard a lot of conversations about AI, but less than 2% of bills even touched artificial intelligence in the education space, which is so interesting because that is still new territory as states have these conversations around guardrails or AI literacy, data privacy. All those conversations are still not really happening. Or let me take that back. They're happening, but the bills are not moving, right? Like the conversations are coming up, but we don't necessarily know what to put into law at times. And so we're not seeing bills really move in that same way that we have conversations around what's happening in the classroom or, mental health conversations, social media, cell phones. I mean, cell phone conversations this year about limiting cell phone use in schools was a huge topic across the country.
Yeah, that happened here as well. And I think that AI is just such a big change that educators don't quite know what to do with it yet.
Mhm.
I mean, yes, we know we need guardrails. We know we need to figure out how to teach this as a tool instead of a quick answer, all those kinds of things. But you've got everybody from we just want to ban it to, let's really dig in because this is the skill set of the future and everything in between. So
How do you feel about AI in the classroom?
I feel that we have to have AI in the classroom because that's what the real world is moving towards. When I talk to recruiters from companies now, one of the number one skill sets that they are they're looking for is AI proficiency.
Mhm.
So if, in my opinion, we are preparing our students to be good, productive citizens in the world that we live in today. And in order to do that, they're going to have to learn these skill sets. But I also think that it's a really, really good time to kind of make that move from all content based
Mhm.
to more inquiry based. It's really going to be, the people who are going to be lifelong learners, who are going to be successful in the future, are going to be able to ask really good questions
Yep.
and be able to utilize AI as a tool to be able to answer some of those questions. But they're going to have to learn how to, take in brand new information that's never existed before, evaluate it, look at, what its applications are. Are they credible sources? And then turn around and apply it and deploy it.
Well, and that's why I think computer science is still so important as a topic. And I know a lot of states have said, well, with AI, you don't need to teach coding. And I think like we have calculators, but we still teach arithmetic, right? Right. So why would we not teach the skills? And when you think of computer science and computational thinking, critical thinking, creativity, these are all skills we want students to have. But you're so right, being able to evaluate. You can use generative AI to pump out a code and read it, but you want to, if there's a mistake, you want them to understand it, right?
No,
Yeah, and
exactly.
it's the same. I can go on to ChatGPT right now and have it write a thesis for me. But like we all know, if you read my thesis, you're going to look at it and be like, that those thoughts are not connecting in the same way that they should if had you written it. And it's the same way, I think, when we think about coding in general. And so you're right, I 100% agree. We should be kind of embracing the conversations and really thinking about what that means. I also think that we have not shaken up we're shaking it up a little bit when I talk about consumer markets and education, but we have not changed the way we teach.
No.
In a very long time. It's like, I always say it's like a factory workers, right? Like you sit in your seat for hours on end. I have a 7-year-old at home. She cannot sit still for that long. We're not pumping out factory workers anymore, right? That idea that I need to sit in my station for hours and hours and do the same monotonous task over and over again. I would love, and I've seen this with alpha schools. I don't represent alpha schools, but I've seen this with the alpha school model where you do 1-2 hours of like your traditional core subjects and then start applying it, right? It is interacting with your classmates. It's building a business plan. It is application. And I think it was Ben Franklin that once said, like, you can tell me something and I'm not going to learn, right? Like that idea, like, tell me, you can teach me and I'll remember it a little bit, but like, and I am butchering his quote, but ultimately where Ben Franklin went was like, but if you show me, right, like that hands-on application, now I am learning. And like, that is how I think about some of these school models. And I'd love to see one day policy drive. Now that is essentially like a complete remodeling of how we do things. Yeah.
But that's really what needs to happen, right? It's almost like we need a revolution instead of evolution in our education system. But, we have to make do with the systems that we have as far as trying to spur innovation and allow for more and more of those things. One of the things I've been thinking about more and more is how we as a society maybe need to step up a little bit more as an entire ecosystem of learning for our children to be able to really, some of those durable skills are wonderfully put forward in sports and in music education and, with performance-based evaluations. And, there's so much out of school time that could be really supported. And if we could all, sort of get together and realize what are the skill sets that the employers are saying that we really need in the future. And they're all those portrait of a graduate skills, right? It's communication, collaboration, critical thinking, problem solving. Some are pulling in citizenship, which I think is absolutely fabulous in there. But it's really those same sets of skills that every employer is asking for. And so could we not find ways to infuse those skills into everything that we teach? It would just be so cool.
100%.
I'm going to get off my soapbox there. So tell me a little bit.
I completely agree.
I would like to kind of, as far as more of that whole ecosystem and the implementation part, tell me a little bit about TSG Advisors. I was reading that you are the founder of TSG Advisors as well. That sounds fascinating, and it sounds like the next steps out into the to deploy everything that you do in the policy world.
Yep. So that was kind of the thought behind setting up TSG Advisors. And so we start with Southern Group on the lobbying side, and more organizations were coming and saying, but we need to do research. We have this grant we want to go after. We want to think about guidance. And that's not really the space for lobbyists in a lot of ways. And so the evolution of that policy was completing the 5 stage. I always talk about the 5 stages of public policy making and completing that cycle. And so TSG Advisors was born a little over 3 years ago. We at the Southern Group, and I think it shows how, as a firm, we are so thoughtful about policy making and supporting, the entire government cycle, right? That it's not just in the education space. We've thought about it for public safety. We've thought about it for transportation and all, just all those kind of components beyond your traditional legislation to law standards. And so it's a nice little firewall. I helped found that organization. I don't run that organization on the education side these days. And so we do keep a firewall. We're separate companies, but there's so much great synergy. And sometimes we have clients that, come to us for lobbying, but they really need to think about, they need research, or they want to, let's say an ed tech company wants to, they want to show an efficacy study. Well, you need a third party evaluation. And so to have an organization out there that is made up of individuals who have been regulators, right? So they know how a Department of Education or a state university system is going to implement a law, and to be able to think through that has been really fantastic. And I think it just gives us that little bit of a different level when it comes to policy insight as a network, is that we're thinking about it. We also have lobby offices across the Southeast and in Washington, D.C. And so we're constantly talking about bills and how bills are moving through legislatures. And there's just so much synergy in the education space. Things don't just happen in isolation. If it's happening in Florida, it's going to happen in North Carolina and vice versa. And that is where, when we're communicating across the country about policymaking and the implementation, that's where we get to really good policy, right? We learn from others. We learn the good, the bad, we tweak. Sometimes I feel like we don't do enough collaboration across the country when it comes to policy. So I'm glad we're having these types of conversations, and I know they're happening sometimes in vacuums all over the place, but that is what we need to continue to do. So that is a little bit about what we're doing at the Southern Group and TSG Advisors, the TSG network, so to speak.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fabulous idea. And I do agree that collaboration of thought, even if it doesn't work exactly in a new space, it gives you the foundations and the ways to begin. And all of us need to keep iterating, right? I mean, it's like you said with your tweaking bills, is that we've got to always continue to get better and better and better. I love the fact that you have this perspective from having been inside a school district, because education policy is complicated. And especially the finance part, where all the different buckets land and all that kind of thing, to be able to kind of describe that to the average person is really kind of complicated. I'd love to kind of maybe take a couple steps back, and you talk about your 5 phases of policy work. I'm not sure everybody that's listening might know what those are. Would you mind just going ahead and repeating those?
So the 5 stages of public policy is the idea that you have an idea, right? First idea. Then you move into legislation and passing a law. Then it's regulatory, right? You want to regulate. And so that typically happens in a state agency. Then from there, you go into implementation, right? Districts then, like think of a classroom. Now they're implementing. And the last stage of the 5 stages is evaluation, right? Like that evaluation and assessment. Is it working? Is it not working? Do we need to make changes? And then the cycle starts again, right? In theory, idea all the way to assessment. And then you say, all right, we need to make this tweak, or we need to reverse course. And then you kick off the cycle again. And so those are the 5 stages of public policy making. So often we stop, like I said, so often I feel like policymakers, if you're a legislator, your job is a constituent brings you a problem and a solution. You work through it. You work with committee staff. You pass a bill. Your work is done. And then it gets handed off. And I feel like that maybe that's some of the issue, right? Is so often it's like it's a baton going down the track. We're just passing it off along the way. And I would love to see us do more evaluation and assessment on policy, which, we do it periodically, right? When you see a bill that is a cleanup bill, right? And it's just removing obsolete language out of law and statute, that is kind of the assessment of whether that's working or not. A lot of times our assessment comes back and says, hey, in order to do this effectively, we need funding for it, right? Like it's an unfunded mandate and I can't really do this effectively, efficiently, and we need funding, and that's the assessment. But those are the 5 stages. I can't take credit for them. They're not my 5 stages. It's a public policy making thing, but yeah, that's the 5 stages of public policy making.
So is there, like in Florida, is there a mechanism where you do those assessment pieces of kind of tracking back? Or do you wait until there's some sort of kickback from constituents? And then, is there a group that actually does that? Or is that something that citizens are really responsible for coming back to the legislator and saying, we love this part of your bill, but this part is, totally dragging us down?
Yeah, so from my experience, policymaking is either a reaction to a situation, right? A constituent concern, or Department of Education, think of a state agency. They're running into hurdles as they're implementing work, or they continue to see the same problem over and over again. So you're reacting to a situation. We see policymaking more in that regard. There are so many think tanks, though, across the country and in every state that like to evaluate. They evaluate budgets, they evaluate bills that have passed. And I think a lot of times that evaluation and assessment place probably lives within think tanks across the country versus like a stable part of the legislative process. I always think that one other kind of part in that process is like how fast a bill is implemented, right? When we did our massive universal voucher program in Florida, we passed the bill and implemented within 40 days. And you think of the regulatory environment, the implementation environment, there's a communication angle in there with stakeholders that has to happen when you're implementing. And so is there a better timeline? And maybe it's always case by case, but I'd love to see bills moving forward across the country that actually have, like in a staff analysis, what does the implementation would look like, right? Could we do this in 6 months? In order to do this effective, do we need to do this in 2 years? And being thoughtful about implementation on the onset of bill, which means we need to communicate, right? The regulator needs to be talking to the legislator, the policymaker together, and really before we pass bills, thinking about implementation. I think that makes it a little bit seamless. Right now, I don't think that happens as in a formal process as maybe it should. And that's probably across the country.
Well, I think that's an excellent suggestion. That's part of the answer of my final question. But before I get to that, a lot of people talk about how incredibly difficult, education is from as a topic on the Hill. It used to be that it was a very bipartisan sort of an issue. Now it seems like it has become extraordinarily partisan. Is it, how are you feeling as far as that piece of the puzzle, and what kind of challenges is that created for you?
Yeah, I can understand why people feel it's more partisan. I have felt that way too. But what I have found is education touches every single member, right? Like it is real to people. They are parents, they were students, they are grandparents with children in the system, aunts, uncles, friends. It is not a topic that maybe someone doesn't have direct understanding and access or knowledge, personal knowledge. And that's what makes education policy difficult, is it's so personal. How do you tell someone their experience is not my experience, right? A private school, a family who draws down on a state voucher for the private school. Like I used my example of my cousin. How do you take that away and say, well, you just, that your child should stay in the public school system when that didn't work for them? So education becomes so personal. And to me, above it being partisan at times, I think it is the personal nature of education that makes it so much more complicated, because humans are complicated and our experiences are complicated and diverse. And, a state like Florida, we are a large state, but we have big urban centers and large rural areas. And so even as a state, creating policy that works for everyone is very difficult. And so a lot of times I think the best policy is kind of the framework policy with the ability to tailor to your individual communities, because every community is so different. So that's my thought on that one.
And that's exactly the same thought that's really trying to be brought down into classrooms, is that we have created everybody gets the same thing sort of a model. And the reality is our kids are so different that we really need to find ways within that system to kind of tailor to each individual case as a student. So I think that advice is probably good all the way from the top down.
I agree.
Oh, this has been such a great discussion. Let me give you my final question, which is, what would you like for decision makers to know? And you can define who decision makers are. It could be the voters, it could be the legislators, it could be people within the administrations.
I think for this one, I want to talk to the voters. It is so easy to criticize. Believe me, I am full of opinions all the time. My friends know it. And so, but I think when we think of lawmakers, we said it earlier in the kind of the pre-conversation, if your state is passing, like Florida, 1,800 bills, no lawmaker can read through 1,800 bills. When you think about expertise on committees, a legislator might sit on 4 or 5, they might sit on education and healthcare, but they might not be in the healthcare industry. And so there is constantly this knowledge and learning that has to happen. And so, I think sometimes we need to give folks a little bit of grace. And I know that's difficult at times because policy, again, is so personal. And, from my lobbying hat, I think when I walk into a room, like, is there a compromise that can be struck? Can we have this conversation in a respectful way? But can I understand where you're coming from, whether it is you don't fully have all the knowledge in front of you. You have a lot of stressors of politics at play. But I think, I used to have a friend who used to always say we need to disagree without being disagreeable, right? Like have those conversations where even in my own household, my husband and I, we're not going to see eye to eye on every topic, but we will compromise, we'll have conversation, and respect stays at the center of that conversation. And that is where we start to become far more effective in policymaking and far more effective in sharing our ideas with those who are setting the agenda.
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. Thank you so very much, Sheila, for reaching out and for sharing this really insightful conversation. I think that people often don't really realize where education, its policy begins. And that really is with the legislature. A lot of people are like, oh, well, the school district needs to do this. Well, they are following rules that were set by the legislature, et cetera, et cetera. So helping to clarify that is absolutely a gift. And I really appreciate all the work that you do and your insights about Florida. And hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Education Perspectives. Feel free to share your thoughts on our Facebook page. Let us know which education perspectives you would like to hear or share. Please subscribe and share with your friends.